Good afternoon. My name is Brad Jensen. On behalf of the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy, I would like to welcome you to our program today. For those of you who are new here, let me just speak for a moment or two about the Center for Business and Public Policy. It's housed at Georgetown's McDonough School of Business. The idea behind the center is to bring together academic researchers, business people, and policymakers to discuss issues that are at the nexus of business and public policy. Our goal is to have an open, honest, and balanced dialogue about issues at this nexus. We run an active program down here on Capitol Hill. The trade part of the program is co-organized by Bob Bastine and myself. Unfortunately, Bob is at home sick today, so we'll carry on without him. We try to have monthly events, so we are quite grateful to House Ways and Means Committee for being generous and allowing us to use this room. For today, we're going to talk about trade policy and whether trade agreements are in the American interest. Currently, the United States is involved in an ambitious series of trade negotiations with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, and the International Services Agreement, all of which are still being negotiated, all of which hold enormous promise, and if concluded as a group, would have a significant impact on liberalization around the world. Probably the most significant impact maybe since the Uruguay round. So this is a real moment in time where significant liberalization could be achieved. I'm of the opinion, and though I acknowledge that there is a difference of opinion as to whether Trade Promotion Authority, or what people as old as I am know as fast track, is necessary to bring these three negotiations to successful conclusion. I know there's a diversity of opinion here on Capitol Hill. I think there's a diversity of opinion within the administration. Among observers, there's probably a diversity of opinion as well. My sense is that what this at root boils down to is a question about whether trade agreements are good for America. And the TPA, the Trade Promotion Authority discussion, debate, is a proxy for this question. We are fortunate today to have a very distinguished panel to discuss and provide their perspective on this question of whether trade agreements are in America's interests. In order, we have Josh Bivens, who is Research and Policy Director at the Economic Policy Institute. Josh does work on macroeconomics and income inequality and is published in both academic and popular venues in a range of media outlets. Then we will hear from Carolyn Freund, who is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Prior to joining the Peterson Institute, Carolyn was at the World Bank and also at the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. Last, but certainly not least, Nelson Cunningham will speak. Nelson is president and co-founder of McLarty Associates. Prior to leading McLarty Associates, Nelson spent time in the White House, and prior to that, worked here on Capitol Hill. So the way we'll organize this, we'll have the speakers talk for about 8 to 10 minutes each in series, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. Okay, great. Josh?
Thank you to Brad and the other organizers of this panel, and thanks for everybody who showed up. I'm going to say just couple words about the Economic Policy Institute, just so you know where I'm coming from on this issue. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the broad issue of trade agreements and globalization and what their impact has been for American workers. The Economic Policy Institute, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank, and we take our mission as doing research to identify economic policies that will boost living standards of low and moderate income Americans. And so just as to foreshadowing, I would add, there's an addendum to the question that Brad asked, which is, are trade agreements good for the United States? There's a sub-question of who in the United States are they good for and who in the United States are they perhaps not so good for. And so perspective from EPI is low and moderate income Americans. And to give you the punchline first, my view is trade agreements are not particularly good for low and moderate income Americans, haven't been so far. And so the bar for undertaking new ones should be pretty high. And so I personally would be against fast track authority. Let me say sort of 3 points on sort of arguments about trade agreements and their economic impact on the United States. And the 3 arguments basically concern, this is really crude shorthanding, but are they good mercantilism? Are they going to make us increase our trade surplus or at least reduce our trade deficit? Are they good for overall living standards in the United States, and how are those living standards gains distributed? And then I'll just say a couple words. It's a little outside the brief of the panel, but just, what about the case that we should sign trade agreements because they're good for poor workers in other parts of the world? I mean, presumably that should weigh pretty heavily in everybody's utility function, and so we should talk about that. On whether or not they're good mercantilism, I mean, most economists would say that's the wrong ground to grade them by. I would agree with that. And yet people do tend to sort of sell trade agreements that the United States signs on the logic that, well, our tariffs are already pretty low. The people we're signing trade agreements with have higher tariffs. So all else equal, if we liberalize, we're going to be able to export more to them, and that's actually going to create jobs because it's either going to reduce our trade deficit or maybe even increase the surplus. And just one, it's not the right economic argument to be making about this, and two, it just has not worked out that way at all in practice over the past 20 years. And it's not a real surprise either. I mean, net exports, the trade deficit or surplus, really is going to be influenced more than anything else by how exchange rates move, not about how sort of tariffs get cut or not. So I would say the mercantilist argument, which you still hear, the people like to focus on the exports that will be created by an agreement. You should always think to yourself, but what happens to net exports? It's not exports that determine the job impact of trade flows. It's exports minus imports, and that's what needs to move. And there's very little evidence that we've seen a boost to net exports from signing any particular trade agreement. It's also not clear that it's had a malign effect on him. I think what has mostly driven United States trade deficits over the past 15, 20 years has been exchange rate movements that are only kind of tangentially related to the pen on paper of trade agreements, but that's that. So then the more serious economic argument for why expanded trade or trade liberalization is something the United States should undertake, and that's the effect on overall national income. And so I would say a couple things. One, I'm enough of an economist that I would grant that almost surely trade liberalization raises total national income in the United States, and does in our trading partners as well. But then I would also remind people, and this one doesn't make it in policy debates near as much. So that's like chapter 1 of the trade textbook, is that both countries overall should get richer as a result of trade liberalization. You don't have to go too much further, like chapter 2 or 3, to realize that especially when you're talking about trade between sort of a country like the United States that is capital abundant in credentialed, skilled workers, when it starts trading with much poorer countries that are mostly abundant in pure labor, pretty scarce in capital and skills, you should see a profound effect on the distribution of income within those both countries. And particularly in the United States, what you should expect is people who own capital, and human capital and physical capital, should benefit a lot from expanded trade, and people who do not should actually often be expected to be outright losers. And I think that's been the case in the United States. So basically, as a result of expanded trade, we have higher national income than we would have otherwise, but low and moderate income Americans are, I would argue, worse off, even in absolute terms. that's the traditional model that says they're worse off in absolute terms. You can tweak it to say, no, they only lose in relative terms. But still, the idea that trade liberalization, expanded trade, the textbook economics says that's good for everybody in the United States. That's just not true. There are really profound distributional implications, and they've been pretty bad for low and moderate income Americans. And the way to think about it, I think, is too often people say that the real benefit of trade is cheap imports, lower prices for imported goods, and that's true, but there's a flip side, which is trade also makes exports more expensive. Now, that's supposed to be good for us as a whole because we consume more imports than we do exports, and so we're able to expand our consumption possibilities after trade happens. But what that should make you realize is that there's a large gross gain from trade for the winners, there's a large gross loss from the losers, and then the net of those two things is going to be much smaller than those gross gains and losses. And so I think that's what makes it so hard to then move on to the next sort of political argument, which is, oh, yes, there are some losers from trade, but we should just compensate them. Trade makes us so much richer that it's going to be easy to compensate the people who've lost. It's not the case. The net winnings from trade for the United States economy, we already have really low tariffs. The idea that further liberalization is going to make an explosion of income in the United States, it's really hard to make that case. It's really hard to make the case that there will be enough of a net gain from doing further trade liberalization that it's going to be very easy to compensate the losers. And let me say something about the losers, too. It's not just people who lose their jobs because of imports. There's the Washington Post today or yesterday at some point, someone was making the argument that there's just not that many losers from trade anymore because we have a small manufacturing sector. And that's where most trade happens. And so it's not just workers who directly lose their jobs because they've been displaced by imports. It's then the workers who look like them in terms of credentials and skills and relevant labor market characteristics, who they then compete for jobs in non-tradable sectors with. So to say it another way, landscapers don't get replaced by imports. They do have to compete for jobs with the auto workers who do get displaced by imports, and that drives down wages for sort of non-college labor across the board. And so anyone who just sort of tries to look at the number of workers displaced from manufacturing as that's a small group, we can compensate them. It's not going to be that expensive. We can take the winnings from trade and use it to compensate that group. That really underestimates the number of people who could be potentially damaged by trade. And I think it also, to my mind, undercuts a little bit that the argument for trade promotion authority is that the gains from trade are really broad-based but diffuse. It's like, it's the fact that I can buy a slightly cheaper DVD player, which, for me, that's not a huge gain, but you multiply that by 80 million people who can do that, and it gets really large. But the losers are very concentrated, and they know they've been hit by trade. And so there's no constituency on behalf of expanded trade, and yet there's very dedicated opponents to it. I think that's actually literally the opposite. There are more losers than winners from trade, or at least the numbers are very close. And a lot of the people being hurt by trade probably don't even really know it. It's those workers in the non-tradable sectors who continue to have a job after a trade agreement is signed, but find their wage growth much slower than it would have been had they not had to compete with the people who are displaced by imports from expanded trade. And then the last thing I'll say, and so I guess I've done some work on trying to estimate the effect of rising trade overall, not just spurred by putting pen to paper on trade agreements, by rising trade overall on American workers. It doesn't explain the majority of the increase in, say, income inequality we've seen. It doesn't explain the majority of, say, the gap between median wages and overall productivity. But it explains enough that my sense is that, compared to levels in 1979, the levels of trade with less developed countries we have today probably cost sort of the median non-college worker something on the order of $1,500, $2,000 a year in foregone wages relative to the scenario where they're not competing implicitly with imports from LDCs. I don't know, is that number big or small? It's hard to think of an economic policy lever that sort of moves that much money around, at least one that's in play today. So to my mind, that's not a small number. And maybe we can talk more about that in the give and take about how I get that number, how it compares to other things. And then just one last word on access to the U.S. market from developing countries, which, it's a real concern. If we think that having access to the U.S. market on behalf of workers in developing countries is a good thing, and I think it is a good thing, then shouldn't we be in favor of these trade agreements on those grounds? And that's the one that I think is actually the shakiest argument for them. I mean, the way to think about these trade agreements are they do provide, on the one hand, better access to the U.S. market. We lower our tariffs, we lower non-tariff barriers, but there's a lot of things that the other signatories have to agree to in exchange for that access to the U.S. market. I mean, take the case in lots of trade agreements. There are things that say other countries have to adopt U.S.-style intellectual property protection and change their copyright law to conform to the U.S. style copyright and patent law. That's a really expensive thing to ask a developing country to have access to the U.S. market. I mean, you're basically asking poor country governments to devote resources to becoming bill collectors for pharmaceutical and software companies. That's a pretty high hurdle for them to get over just to have access to the U.S. market. So the idea that these trade agreements, you can just assume that they are expanding cheap access to the U.S. market on behalf of developing country workers, I don't think that's necessarily the case. And it's another reason I would argue I think there should be a high bar in terms of there should be a real look at what is contained in these trade agreements and some real democratic debate before they get passed. And I think Trade Promotion Authority sort of short circuits that debate. And so, yeah, I think I'll end there.
Thank you.
Hi, let me second the thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm from the Peterson Institute for International Economics, which is also a nonpartisan think tank, but our view tends to be very global, so not just about the American worker, but about workers around the world, and also pro-efficiency and pro-growth. So I think one thing that Josh said, which all economists would agree with, is that trade expands the pie, but what it does is it shifts around the distribution of that pie a little bit. So we all agree that a trade agreement's going to help the U.S. What is difficult is that it also shifts around how big a slice of that pie we all get. And so if you're concerned about a specific group, then you may be less inclined to favor the agreement. But there's something else that I'd like for you to think about when you think about trade, which is technology. So if we were to open trade in sugar, which is a highly protected sector in this country, some of our sugar sector would be out of business. Actually, these are mostly capital-rich, wealthy people, not the workers, but they would be out of business. But you know who else went out of business recently is travel agents. And travel agents didn't go out of business because of trade. They went out of business because of the internet. Switchboard operators went out of business years ago, and they went out of business because electronics could do their job. So it's not just trade that changes the distribution and changes jobs, it's technology. And technology and trade have really amazingly similar effects on workers. So they hurt some, they help others. They hurt the workers whose jobs can get mechanized, but they make products cheaper for all of us. They increase the variety of products we can go out and buy. They increase growth, so the pie is getting bigger. And I don't think anybody in this room would say, okay, let's slow down technology. I mean, because we're worried about the switchboard operator. No, we need to do other things. For the country to grow, you need to get into the new occupations. And a whole new type of travel agency developed that specializes in really, exotic vacations and stuff that would have been much harder to book without the internet. So my point is that in terms of its economic effects, trade and technology are almost identical. And on all accounts, technology's had a much, much bigger impact in the US than trade has, especially when you think of, say, NAFTA. Mexico is smaller than California. Adding Mexico to the US economy is going to have marginal effects. It's going to have big effects on Mexico, which is good for us because the Mexicans are our neighbor, and it's better for us if we live near a rich country than a poor country. and it's a bigger market, et cetera, even from an economic standpoint, but also just from a social standpoint, et cetera. So why is trade so controversial? I think this is one thing that sometimes flummoxes economists, because technology is not controversial. Why should trade be? And I think it's exactly the point Josh made about a trade deficit. So in technology, we don't think about a technology deficit. And so what the trade deficit's doing is, just by pure national income accounting, you have your total income has to be consumed, invested, used by the government, or you export it minus the imports you consume. So the exports minus the imports directly feed into output. And to the extent that that thing is negative, it's a minus. To the extent it's positive, it's feeding in a positive way. And in the U.S., since NAFTA was approved, we've been tending to run trade deficits on the order of 3.5%. And so this, not with the NAFTA countries, but a global trade deficit. So I think this is what gets people concerned about trade, and especially now when things are slow versus 2006 when the economy was growing quite quickly. But I think Josh made another really good point, which is the trade deficit's actually not determined by trade policy. In fact, the countries with the highest tariffs in the world, the 5 countries with the highest tariffs in the world, all have trade deficits. They all tend to be really small countries, and they need to import a lot. But even within our emerging markets, the 2 highest tariff countries are Brazil and India. They both have trade deficits. So it's not the case that trade policy is the instrument to affect a trade deficit, because national income accounting also tells us that the trade deficit is the result of savings and investment. So countries that save a lot, like China, run trade surpluses. Countries that have more investment than savings have trade deficits. And that's what's driving the trade deficit, and things like exchange rates, which feed into savings and investment behavior, are going to affect that. But trade policy isn't, and especially if bilateral trade policy. So, tariffs in a specific product against one country, all it's going to do is increase your imports at a higher price from another country. So this trade policy seems to me to be an odd way to think about addressing the jobs issue. It's about the type of jobs, and you do want policies that work for adjustment, so help workers that might lose a job from trade, just as you would want to help workers that lose a job from technology, just as you want distributional policies in your country, but you don't necessarily want to slow it down. And I just also want to give you some facts about why we like it. Exporters tend to pay 15% more than other firms. Look at the big multinationals, they pay even higher wages. These big companies are also the companies that are responsible for about 60% of private capital investment, and 85% of spending on R&D. So these are like the technology growth, high-paying companies that are our exporters, and giving them more markets abroad and improving resource allocation that way is good. And just let me talk really briefly about the types of agreements we're thinking about. I think NAFTA has ended up being somewhat controversial, in part because of when it started, there was Ross Perot and the giant sucking sound and all that, for those of us who remember 20 years ago, and that sort of stuck to it, that negative. But as I said before, Mexico is very small relative to the U.S. The people who say it has really big negative effects are wrong. But I would also argue the people who say it has really big positive effects on the U.S. are also wrong. It it has positive effects, but to say it's a lot of jobs is kind of crazy when you're thinking about trade with a country that is so much smaller than the U.S. The two agreements we're thinking about now, which I think it's more important to think to the future, are the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Agreement, the TTIP. And both of these agreements are really important because they expand the market. So the TPP global economy would be 50% bigger than NAFTA. TTIP would be 75% bigger than NAFTA. They both also serve our political interests in some sense, in that TPP is a good way of dealing with growing China. And in the case of TTIP, I think especially now, it's and I'm sure Nelson can talk more about this, it's a great way of addressing Russia, et cetera. So why don't I stop there, and then we can talk more about those agreements in the question session. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Well, those were two terrifically focused and well-presented economic arguments for and against, or against and for trade agreements. I'm going to talk to you about the non-economic arguments for trade agreements. If, as Carolyn says, well, there's some good things about trade agreements, there's some bad things about them, why do we bother to do them? Why do they make a difference today? And I would argue that trade agreements are probably the single most important fashion in which modern countries exert their influence and power with their allies and show their disfavor to those whom they oppose. How did we get here? At the end of World War II, the United States was the world's unrivaled superpower. We were the only nuclear power. We had by far the largest military resources. We had, I think, roughly 50% of the world GDP, if I recall correctly, at that time, one country. And the United States at that time decided that it was important to create a rule-bound system for governing global institutions. The United States decided to voluntarily limit its own power by helping to create the UN, by helping to create the IMF and the World Bank, and by helping to create the GATT, which at that time was probably the least important of those institutions, but became over time more important. The US also bound itself in other ways through NATO, in its military alliances across the Atlantic, bound itself with Pacific allies in military alliances. Why did the United States do this? Why did the United States voluntarily limit its unbridled power at the end of World War II? Because it recognized that in a world that was as war-torn as the one we then had, a world in which so many people were living in poverty, they were just coming off of being colonies of great European powers, it would be to the United States' tremendous advantage to create a system in which governments would abide by international rules, would have the discipline of international agreements, would themselves agree to limit their own power to these international institutions. And I would argue that this has probably been the most significant impact in the post-World War period. The world that we helped create, in which we have helped bring, yes, we had the Cold War, but the Cold War had a pretty clear outcome. We won, they lost. A large part of it was because of the economic agreements that we put in place, which showed the benefits and the advantages of our system of government and of economic management versus the communist countries' economic management. The result of that has been that literally billions of people around the world have been brought out of poverty, have been brought into a global system that rewards literacy, that rewards discipline, that rewards work, that rewards engagement in a formal economy, and that rewards peaceful relations with neighbors. Right after World War II, we tended to rely more on economic agreements. I'm addressing you now as a foreign policy practitioner. I worked in the Clinton White House on Latin American trade relations. I advised candidate John Kerry on his international and economic policy back in 2004. Right after World War II, we tended to rely more on military agreements because that suited the times. But over time, that least important of the post-war institutions, the GATT, and that family of economic agreements became more important. And as we saw the power of the Soviet Union wane and the need for us to have massive militaries facing and using that as the principal force exercising power around the world, we began, I think, very sensibly and smartly to use economic agreements to bind our allies to us, to deepen ties with those with whom we wish to strengthen relationships, and to punish or isolate those whom we believed were not acting in the interests of the United States or the international order. And we've been very strategic in the way that we have negotiated trade agreements over the years. The first one in 1985, and these are fairly recent, right? 1985 was our first free trade agreement, was with Israel. Clear geopolitical impact there. The second was with Canada, our closest ally, the world's longest undefended border, et cetera. Moving forward, Mexico, Chile, Jordan, Singapore, Australia, Morocco, which is a key ally in Northern Africa, Central America. We added Panama so that we had a sweep all the way down deep into Latin America, Bahrain, Oman, Peru, Colombia. Each of these have been deeply strategic relationships for the United States. Indeed, if we did not have trade agreements, if we did not have the power to craft trade agreements, how could we show and strengthen alliances with our key allies around the world? As a foreign policy practitioner, our toolkit would be completely impoverished if we did not have trade agreements with which to order our relationships with our allies. Let me turn quickly to where we are today and at the two agreements we've talked about, the TTIP and TPP. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, as Caroline mentioned, it's an absolutely sensible way for us to order and to structure China's economic and military rise, for us to create a broad economic alliance with the rest of the Pacific powers, both down the Pacific coast of the Americas and the key powers in Asia, non-Chinese powers in Asia, to create an ordered trading system with all of those countries, which will present China with a choice. Do they join an ordered trading system also and get the benefits from that, or do they remain outside of that ordered trading system and fight and struggle against it and attempt to compete against what would be, in effect, a trading bloc of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of persons balanced against China's 1.1 billion? That strikes me as an extraordinarily sensible way for us to be looking at China and looking to channel China's rise. If we don't have TPP, what are our options? Marines on Okinawa? It becomes a very difficult task to decide how do we confront the Chinese if we don't have the tool of economic agreements. Let's look at TTIP. Let's look at what we're doing with the Europeans. I think of TTIP as an economic NATO. NATO is essential to global security and to our security and to that of Europe. We're seeing it today with the Ukrainian crisis and in Crimea. we're reminded of the incredible value that our military alliances with our key allies have. TTIP strengthens that immeasurably by creating a trading bloc between the US and the EU that will make our interests even more congruent, that will make us act even more as one in facing those who are rogue or disordered powers like Russia, and give us increased capacity to constrain their behavior. If we don't have the capacity to conclude TPP, if we don't have the capacity to conclude TTIP, as a foreign policy practitioner, I'm beginning to come up empty, other than military deployments, which, by the way, when you look at the size of the military budget and you look at how much is spent on that and ask, how does that impact low-income workers in the United States? I'd argue that in effect, it's a necessary but a tremendous tax on our economy that we have to impose in order to have the world's largest military system. We need to buttress it with economic systems and agreements and constraints that allow us to supplement our military power. So I think there's a lot to be said then. Fine, if we're going to have trade agreements, what kind of trade agreements ought we have to minimize the impact on the lower paid workers? And I think Josh is absolutely correct in focusing our attention on them and on insisting that we think about the impact that trade agreements have on those who are least prepared to deal with the globalized world. If we leave those people behind, as a country, we've lost our moral compass. I worked for a President, Bill Clinton, who was very pro-trade, but understood that trade agreements had to respond to the economic needs of those who were going to be left behind, and had to embed policies, whether it's lifting up other nations' trade standards, ensuring that they live up to environmental restrictions that benefit us all, and have robust programs here at home to work to retrain and buttress those workers who are left behind, I think is absolutely essential. And I think, frankly, we could do more. And I wish that some of the pro-trade Republicans would share that view and would wish to do more to help ensure that the pain is less concentrated and that we do lift up all of those who would otherwise be left behind. So we absolutely need trade agreements. Without them, the foreign policy toolkit would be impoverished. But we need to make sure that those trade agreements don't hurt more people than they help.
So that was a rich and nuanced set of presentations for which I personally am grateful. I'm going to abuse the moderator's privilege and try to get the ball rolling on questions and ask the first question. So much of the discussion felt like kind of fighting the last war, looking back to NAFTA, thinking about liberalizing vis-a-vis emerging markets, labor abundant, low wage emerging markets. And I think implicit in all the discussion, there was talk of tariffs, which leads me to think about goods, merchandise, manufacturing. I want to challenge particularly Josh and Carolyn to let's think forward to TPP and TTIP and the International Services Agreement, 3 negotiations that are ongoing, which are largely negotiations among countries that are relatively wealthy, and where tariff barriers on goods, with notable exceptions like sugar, there are some spikes, but largely tariff barriers are pretty low already. In contrast, in the service sector, where I believe the United States has a comparative advantage, in contrast to manufacturing, where we don't, particularly vis-a-vis low-wage economies. The service sector is big in the United States, it's high wage, it's growing, to me, it seems like a natural opportunity for growth. And thinking about TPP and TTIP and the International Services Agreement, the opportunity to set the rules of the game, as Nelson talked about, going forward in the services area seem to be ripe. So I was just wondering if Josh and Carolyn, if I could implore you to speculate. I understand it's speculation, and it's from the seat of the pants. But you know, what do we think the trade-offs would be? I agree that, you know, past trade agreements have dislocated and have had negative effects on workers that have competed with, you know, low-skill workers elsewhere. But the world has changed, and the kind of agreements we're talking about have changed. So it's, to me, there seems more opportunity in the service sector and less risk in the manufacturing sector. But that's my bias, and I just wonder if you could try to spin it out, TPP and TTIP, given the kinds of commitments that are on the table and the set of countries that we're in the conversation with. What do you think on balance, net, good or bad, and where are the big risks? And I don't know, who wants to go first? Josh? Okay.
Yes, all this. So, any response to that is going to be wildly speculative. So, but you asked for it anyway. So, and just a couple quick remarks, and I promise they'll be quick on the other ones. I mean, I would not describe myself as anti-trade agreement. I mean, I should be really clear here. I'm perfectly fine with a rules-based trading system. I don't think much of the rules we have in place. I think the rules we have in place go out of their way to protect some people and not protect others. It protects very well, say, holders of patents and copyrights, which tend to be pretty rich corporations. It does not protect in any way sort of workers from lower labor standards in the rest of the world. And even the labor standards agreements that were part of, say, NAFTA, that they're completely side agreements. They don't have anywhere near the enforcement authority that, say, a violation of copyright protections or patent protections would be. So a rules-based system is fine. I think the system we have has the wrong rules. I think part of, you know, and Caroline mentioned, you know, probably the biggest challenge, problem, whatever, in trade flows today is trade imbalances. And that's mostly an issue of exchange rate policy. But to my mind, if we are making international rules of trade and we have this very big challenge out there, that to me says loud and clear that exchange rate policy should be a part of these agreements, and yet it's not. And so again, I'm wondering, you know, it's not I'm against a rules-based trading system. I think the rules we have are wrong. They're either protecting the wrong people or they're not bringing in the really important stuff. One, and I can't resist this one just because it's an economic thing. I mean, I think another thing that separates trade and technology is that the bias of who technology hurts is never obvious ahead of time. You know, there's a strong case to be made that in, you know, the early 1900s, technology was strongly favoring sort of less credentialed workers. And it boosted their wages a lot. And I think there's really strong evidence that the alleged bias towards skills and away from other workers of technology since like 1995 on is just actually really not there. And so the idea that, you know, technology does the same thing as trade with less developed countries, you know, not always. It does sometimes for sure. It doesn't always ahead of time. And so, and again, technology is hard to, even if you wanted to, no one wants to, it's hard to stop. Whereas signing an agreement with a completely predictable bias about which workers will be helped versus hurt, that is something that can be stopped or slowed down. I think that also explains some of the different, you know, treatment about it. So in regards to TTIP and TPP, I mean, I would say TPP, it's more mixed than TTIP. You're right. It's countries roughly as rich as us. It's not purely labor abundant versus capital abundant trading story. TPP is a little more mixed. There are some poorer countries in there. So in terms of TTIP, so it's true. My concerns about, you know, that it will reliably increase inequality if we sign TTIP, I'm not sure about that. We're still a little capital abundant relative to lots of Europe, but it would be pretty small effects. It's true. To me, the bigger issue is to ensure that trade agreements we sign do not infringe on other countries' rights to have the sort of social insurance systems, the regulatory systems, the labor protection systems they want. These are democratic countries, if they've put in place a bunch of social insurance, regulatory, social standards in their country that they are happy with, it would be a shame to see them ever get threatened by a trade agreement. And I think that's a real possibility. Yeah, I'll say I don't know much about TTIP, the legalistic specifics of what is in there so far. I definitely know that if you talk to, say, lots of European parties on the left, that they would worry a lot that what they would call sort of the EU social state could be threatened by, relative to Europe, we're kind of a low standard country in a lot of ways, and their standards have been democratically applied, and so I think that's that to me is, I think, the larger issue in regards to trade agreements. In response to Nelson's query about, without trade agreements, how can we help allies, and how can we signal our our antipathy toward people who are acting rogue? You don't really need trade agreements. You could do that with unilateral trade policy. I mean, anytime we decide we like a country, they're an ally, they should have access to the U.S. market, give it to them. You don't need a trade agreement to give them full access to the U.S. market, which is the real benefit of the trade agreement from their perspective. These trade agreements don't just give that access away, they demand something from the signatories in exchange for it. And so I think that's part of the problem here, is the idea that, you need this trade. Textbook economics says, you can get all the benefits of trade you want unilaterally. You don't actually need an agreement. And so an agreement is not actually doing it a favor with the other country. It's actually asking something of them in exchange for better access to your market. If we want to reward people or punish people with trade policy, you don't need an agreement to do that. You can just do it unilaterally. And so I think part of the issue with my problem with the sort of logic of trade agreements is we ask a lot of other countries in exchange for access to the U.S. market. And in the case of, say, the EU, I worry that ask will be an infringement upon sort of the social and regulatory state that they have and they like. Or if they don't like it, they can change it. They're democracies. So in terms of the economic effect of TTIP, yeah, you're right. Absent some thing I'm totally missing, which is possible, I think it would be more modest than, say, our trade patterns with China. U.S. and China are very different countries. We're much more capital abundant. There's going to be a profound effect on U.S. income distribution from trading with a very large country that is that different from us. Trading with the EU, that effect will be much less pronounced. So that's my wild speculation.
Let me just start with something Josh said that perplexed me a little bit, which is we don't need reciprocity. So he's saying we should just unilaterally liberalize to countries. Reciprocity is at the heart of the WTO. It's at the heart of our trade agreements. It's there for the political reasons. Mexico democratized under NAFTA. Colombia changed its policy towards trade union workers before it got an agreement. Looking to the EU, the Eastern European countries made numerous reforms for their own economies in order to get into the EU. And this is hugely beneficial. So the best thing we can do by offering a trade agreement is getting a country to make reforms that helps itself, and in the process also getting market access. Why, we all say trade is good, so we should just unilaterally liberalize. That would be the economist's kind of first best. But there are special interests that prevent you from doing that. The sugar case I mentioned in the EU, or other industries, steel maybe in some countries tends to be a big one. So reciprocity is at the heart of trade agreements. It serves everyone's interest, and it allows us both to extract much more from our partners, but it also allows the governments in those countries to make reforms that otherwise might be intolerable to the people because they're getting access to the U.S. market or access to the German market. So reciprocity is really at the heart of trade agreements. So I really think it's important to emphasize that. Going to the question that Brad asked about TPP and TTIP, it's TPP where I go to NAFTA, because every journalist who calls me to ask a question about TPP brings up NAFTA. So I think we just have to address it head on. And we look at who's in TPP, and it's our NAFTA countries, which is part of the reason it's going to come up. And then there also are some developing countries or really strong manufacturing exporters. So there's Vietnam, But there's also Japan, Malaysia, countries that we have had a history of having sort of large manufactured imports from. So TPP to me, again, is the more controversial one. I don't think people are as concerned about TTIP, although we were talking about it before, and it might be just because TPP is first on the agenda and TTIP is second. So there is a bit of the same issues of developing country access, and then you also have some of the Latin Americans in there, Peru, Chile, et cetera. But keep in mind one thing, we already have a free trade agreement with 6 of these countries. So there's not, it's going deeper on some issues. They tend to be issues that are important to us, like IPR, ag access, things like that. In addition, there is the possibility in TPP of having a currency chapter. Honestly, I'm still not sure how I feel about that. On the one hand, I do think there has become a real problem with currency manipulation in the world, and that is what's driving our deficits and hurting us. And not just hurting us, but hurting developing countries outside of the countries that are engaged in these policies. On the other hand, do we really want to throw something like currency into a trade agreement that is going to be very difficult to implement? Is it better handled in a different form? And I'm not sure, and I think there's very good arguments on both sides on that one. Going to some of the other things Brad said, one of the things that's nice about these agreements is there's a real possibility to expand services. And and Brad can speak to these statistics better than I can, but services are 70% of workers in the US, yet they're only 30% of our exports. So if we can expand in this sector where we really have a comparative advantage, think of our engineers, our accountants, our lawyers, all these kinds of things that we could do globally, especially as countries build up their infrastructure and they need engineers to design bridges and dams and all these kinds of things, and architects. There's a real possibility for a surge in U.S. exports via the service sector. And just consider that within NAFTA, which does have provisions on services, the U.S. has done really well. And services exports from the U.S. to Canada and Mexico grew faster since NAFTA was started to today than services exports from the rest of the world. In contrast, services exports to other countries in the world from U.S. to the rest of the world over this period grew slower. Now, in part, it's starting from a higher base, so it's harder, but it was also starting from a higher base in Canada and Mexico. So getting government procurement and these kinds of things could be really, really beneficial for the U.S., especially in these markets that are really big. I mean, we're talking about Japan in the case of TTIP, and Germany and France and these countries in the case of TTIP. Then, I think that's my phone, I'm sorry. And then the final thing I was going to say is about regulatory reform that's possible through TTIP. My grandmother lived in Germany, and she reached an age at some point where she could no longer drive. So we wanted to import her Mercedes. Well, we couldn't do it because it turned out the windshield was slightly different from the U.S. thickness. There were certain differences. It was going to cost us more than buying a new Mercedes to import that, 10-year-old Mercedes. And this is the kind of thing where if we can agree to the same regulations in things like autos and pharmaceuticals, there would be just huge benefits to consumers and to companies that don't have to do, 2 different cars, one for Germany and one for the US, and just tremendous productivity gains for everybody. So there's really a lot to be gained there. And if you want to quantify it in terms of jobs, in net, I mean, I hate to do that, it's speculative, but in some sense it would come through the growth effects. So growth effects of these agreements tend to be, you know, around 0.5% or between 0.1% or 0.5% of GDP a year. And then you can think about what the elasticity of job creation is to growth. And, you know, it's going to come out on the order of probably 80,000 to 400,000 jobs a year. But again, this is highly speculative.
Great. Open the floor. Yes.
I'm Tom Goldberg with Lineage Technologies. We deal with high-tech IT equipment. I think that the one thing that I have to endorse, and as a Republican, it's hard to do this, but Mr. Cunningham, right in your wheelhouse there. We need international trade authority to get at the issue of cyber theft, the impact that it has on the U.S. economy writ large. If Keith Alexander runs NSA and Cybercommand is correct, it's $1 trillion a year in losses to this economy. That's 8.4% of our GDP. So all other numbers aside, it's probably the largest number I've seen in terms of annual negative impact. I would ask those of you in the audience to look at the DuPont case that was announced today, where they finally found the perpetrator for the theft of the TiO2, titanium dioxide chemistry. It was their most profitable and one of their oldest products. It was stolen through cyber means. It's being produced in China in equal quality. It's being sold on the market at prices far below that which DuPont had enjoyed for many, many years. And I would say to Josh's point that it isn't going to be the auto worker who is moving toward landscaping, and thank you for that, I may take that up. But in the context of that, it may very well be chemists and executives in management joining those ranks as well. So please, when you think about the need for these venues for dialogue, while it is not traditional to deal with these matters as singular, it could very well be the issue of the day that should stimulate bipartisanship here to bring people to the table and say, we need that authority, we need it now. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Questions? Yes.
Good morning. Robert Alvarez, Aegis Health Security. One area that you mentioned services is health, the health area. And I'm just wondering what's your take on, you know, we have NGOs that do a lot of global health projects, et cetera, but U.S. direct investment in health markets outside the U.S. I just wanted to have your take on it, if possible.
Well, I'm actually not that familiar. The only thing I would say is actually, and I would draw this more from my experience working at the World Bank, that health is an interesting area because if insurance were portable, it would be so beneficial globally, because imagine when you want to retire, if you could take or need to go to a nursing home, if you could go and do that in Jamaica instead, in a nice warm climate instead of here. So, I mean, I personally believe globalizing healthcare has huge benefits, but I'm not sure that's what you were getting at in the question. Do you know, Brad, from your work on services?
That's sort of, yeah, like global, like medical tourism, if you're going to go that route, and how we can...
The benefits are just tremendous from that, and the issue in the U.S. has been the refusal, even within any trade agreements that we have, to allow people to take that insurance outside, and it would be great for countries that can support it, as well as for individuals who need those services. And already we see, especially actually a lot of low-income people going to places like India for surgeries because it's so much cheaper. Uninsured people, which maybe they won't be anymore, fortunately, but and so this is a huge, I mean, this could be a huge global business, and I think also productive for the U.S. because there's many areas where clearly people do and would want to come here as well.
Yeah, just a couple words. I mean, I totally agree with that. But to me, it's sort of another indication of who the rules of trade agreements work for and who they don't. I mean, this is money on the table. If we could actually get some way to enable people to take their American insurance money and get reimbursed somewhere else, and I'll bet it's not a real accident that hasn't happened yet. That would be the loss of business to medical providers in the United States who are really politically influential, and presto, it has not happened. And you see the same thing. It would also be hugely beneficial if we could re-import generic pharmaceuticals from other countries that make them much more cheaply. Canada, India, a lot of places have high quality pharmaceuticals that they charge much less for than in the United States. Not only, is that not really, that is accounted for in trade agreements, it is actively barred. U.S. consumers are generally not allowed to have access to those cheaper generics because it is in the interests of the patent holders, the pharmaceutical companies, to not give them that access. And so we have a rules-based trading system. I like a rules-based trading system. I just don't like the rules we have.
I think that this is an area where there could be large gains. I think it also points out some of the difficulties in negotiating these agreements because it's not tariffs.
That's why I brought it up, because it's not really
Yeah.
a big topic when you study trade agreements.
Yeah.
So like the recent one with Korea, they have a large market medical tourism in Asia. I didn't see it there, and it's kind of,
Yeah.
it's a great area to open up.
Well, it goes to a point Carolyn made earlier about regulatory harmonization or convergence. And it's hard work because it has to be done kind of industry by industry. There are powerful interests in all countries, that may want to impede that liberalization. The United States, the Doctors Guild is powerful and has an influence on how things work here and what can be, quote, imported, or where you can take your insurance and where you can't. And I think, this is an area where there is enormous opportunity. I think it also points out the need not just for regulatory convergence, but also bilateral investment treaties or foreign direct investment and rules around that. It may make sense for U.S. hospitals to operate hospitals elsewhere, but that gets into a different kind of regulation as well. So I think it's an area of enormous opportunity, but it highlights a lot of the difficulties.
You just, Stanley Knowledge, Georgetown University Business School, you just mentioned the investment grant. What about the I in TTIP? Can you comment on the investment provisions and impacts if they come into being?
No, I don't know what the provisions are in TTIP yet on investment. I mean, the bilateral investment relationship between the EU and the US is already very significant. I don't know that there are, or at least I haven't heard talk of important innovations in that. I think the I just may be to recognize the large existing relationship in that. But that's you've laid bare my ignorance, Stan, as usual.
I'm not familiar enough, I'm sorry.
My guess is
Yeah.
there's no I there. If you don't know, there's no I.
Well, that agreement's still at quite an early stage, and things haven't all been released. So I think, and probably our colleagues Jeff Schott and Gary Huffbauer could speak better to this, but I'd be happy to look into it. But I don't want to speak out of turn or out of knowledge.
And I guess I think that, again, it goes to, because the relationship is quite deep already, the remaining impediments might not be formal investment barriers, but the kinds of things like regulatory treatment in financial services. Dodd-Frank is, a regulatory framework that has influenced European banks' positions in the United States. So I think it's meant to highlight the need to harmonize, or at least to strive for harmonization in these regulatory regimes to protect investment. But that's speculation. Other questions?
Sorry, Dan Horowitz with Mixed Use Strategies. being driven by the U.S. TR's office here within the White House. The question is, it differs from domestic U.S. law and policy, what has been leaked in the IP provisions. If for some reason USTR decided to withdraw those IP provisions, would that cause a collapse of the U.S. position or the U.S. support for TPP? And if so, or if not, would the other countries finish?
I'll let you take it first, Wayne.
Yes, I'll be quick because I don't know much at all. Short answer, I don't know. I do think, from my perspective, sort of from the perspective of why it is in the interest of U.S. corporations to push for these trade agreements, IP is a big part of it. And so if that's not a big part of it, then what is the constituency for moving TPP forward in the United States is an open question to me. And then from the perspective of our trading partners, I mean, I would think they would see that as a big win if they did not have to adhere to the IP provision. So I don't think it would collapse from that perspective. I think it would be, it would lose a crucial piece of support being pushed forward within the United States, would be my guess.
I think that this has been one controversial part of TPP, and I mean, I think Paul Krugman's recent piece, for those who saw it, didn't particularly help on this, saying that that's what the agreement is about. It's protecting pharmaceutical companies and this and that to maintain their profits. I don't think that's true at all. First of all, I think IP will get in. I think something reasonable will be negotiated, but there's a lot of other things in this agreement. So it's not relying on IP, and that's not where the big benefits lie. So, for example, freer trade in agriculture. There's still a lot of limits in agriculture in Japan. Huge for the U.S. and in some of the other countries as well. Discipline of state-owned enterprises. Even within Mexico, it'd be nice to get more on that, and their move on petrol and energy is a big part of that recently. More coverage of government procurement, as Brad and I have talked about, the services, the huge gains there, huge. So, and e-commerce provisions, going back to what the gentleman said before, new approaches to rules of origin, so you could accumulate rules of origin. For those who don't know, if you're outside of an FTA and Mexico imports something, and then that something comes to the U.S., it needs to go through U.S. tariffs if it's not made in Mexico. So you have to do all this crazy rules of origin stuff. But the more countries that are in an area, you don't need those rules of origin. So it gets much easier. So there's huge benefits outside of IP. And I think IP's been a sticking point, but it's not where the big gains of this agreement are, and I don't know why that has been. I mean, I think it's unfortunate the way the negotiations been going and then leaks have been happening, because I don't think it's been helping garner support for the agreement.
How can there be support if there's no knowledge of what's in the agreement? See, we live in an open democracy, and that type of negotiation would never be allowed here on the Hill. Drafts of bills are always put out, whether the writers and drafters want them to be or not. So it's very counter that the public can't comment on it. The public has no knowledge of it. People are segregated into specific, hey, you're an industry consultant, but you can only consult on the sections that we say you can consult on. So if you're a telecommunications company that actually has to carry and protect intellectual property, you can't consult on how intellectual property will be protected.
Yeah.
So it's counter to U.S. law, Section 2 and Section 3.
I used to work up here on Capitol Hill, and I have to say, I think you're conflating two things. When members of Congress sit down here to negotiate a bill, it's very common for them to do that in a closed room with people they trust, to try to make the hard deals that they that they need to make in order to put something that can get broad support. Now, there comes a time when they have to say, here's the bill, here's what's in it, you get to read it, you get to comment on it, we'll have hearings on it, and then there'll be an up or a down vote on this, right? That's exactly what's going to happen with TPP. They are negotiating no, hang on, can I finish? They are negotiating the terms of the agreement now. You have to have a zone of privacy in order to be able to strike hard deals in any phase of existence, that in any commercial or political endeavor. Once the way our TPA and TPP works, TPA is Congress's way of saying, hey, here are the negotiating objectives. If what you bring back to us meets those negotiating objectives, then it will be subject to an up or down vote. So the negotiators then go out, implement within their negotiations, they negotiate under the terms of that directive, and then they put the text on the table. Everybody gets to read that text, everybody gets to comment on that text. It's brought up for discussion here on Capitol Hill, and there's a vote, up or down. It's no different than any congressional legislation.
But there's a big difference because it's a treaty that's been signed by the U.S., and what you're talking about is ratification by Congress.
And if Congress doesn't approve it, it has no force of law.
There's no force of law to U.S. entities within the U.S., but if you're an international company that operates internationally, and you're operating within another country that is a signatory, that it does hold binding law in that country, doesn't that affect that company differently?
No, that's true of any company that does business around the world. You're subject to other people's laws.
The U.S. company will be held to that standard when it operates in another country because the U.S. government negotiated to that end. They negotiated an agreement. They became a signatory of it. The other countries became a signatory of it.
Yeah.
And then it becomes a binding law in those other countries.
I don't want to beat a dead horse here. I'm not troubled by the fact that the United States is trying to negotiate to benefit U.S. interests in these agreements. And if they get other countries to agree to provisions that benefit U.S. industry, as an American, I'm not going to be particularly concerned about that. But there's nothing going on. These will not be secret agreements by the time it comes to a vote. They will be widely published, discussed, commented upon pieces of paper. So there's always secrecy at the early stages of negotiations, and of course you have to make it public before anything could become binding. But I've said enough.
Doesn't the State Department do like a call out to all the states so they can go and put out their concerns on any agreements? Doesn't the Bilateral Trade Office and state does that? I'm just saying to address his concern. Don't they do that? The Bilateral Trade Office puts out hey, a call to all the states. Here's the trade agreement that are coming up. What are your provisions for it that are going to affect X, Y, Z industry in your state, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm thinking, so before it comes up here, I'm thinking the states also put in their inputs at their level.
There are lots of ways in which people can get input into these processes. At the end of the day, there will be no secret provisions of anything. It will all be read, commented upon, and people will have the ability to judge whether they want to support it or not.
I also think that we have to keep in mind that we also want to be able in a negotiation to deal with our own special interests. And unfortunately, there's great things about American democracy, but unfortunately the way things are functioning, it's the case that if everything was made public, everybody would be throwing their own special interests into that agreement. It would create so much back and forth and additional things going in that you couldn't negotiate. Because in an agreement, the U.S. has to make concessions and the other side makes concessions. That is reciprocity. That's the definition of reciprocity in these agreements. How can you do that if special interests, every time they hear anything, are knocking at the door? Then you can't accomplish anything. Everything will be made public. If there was I guess there's a tension between transparency and special interests in this case that makes it very difficult, and that you're dealing with another country and the U.S. system, that Congress, it just gets very complicated. But as Nelson, I'm not particularly concerned about that, and that's the way things have tended to function. With TPP, the leaks, I think, have made it problematic.
Two quick thoughts. I mean, one, it's true that is the way things have tended to function, and I argue what we have are rules that aren't functioning very well. And I think to my mind, you'd be hard-pressed to argue that the way we do trade agreements now does a good job of making sure special interests don't sort of infect the final document. To me, it's just sort of the special interests who manage to get into the relatively closed sessions. I think the one way it's also, not the one way, another way it's quite different than most legislation is it can't be amended. I mean, if you have a piece of legislation that has some popular stuff in it and then some stuff that is just widely reviled, you can usually take out the reviled stuff. If nobody is willing to stand behind that, there'll be an amendment to strip it. It tends to happen, or at least in theory it could happen. And that can't happen in any of this. It is just a pure take it or leave it bundle of stuff. And so I think that the inability to amend is a big problem. Yeah, and that's it. I mean, I think, like I said, given that I don't love the rules that we have crafted with these trade agreements, to me that is sort of the reason why the concerns about the process are valid.
So additional questions, I guess, yeah, I'll let that go. Question?
My name is Jake Peterson. I work for a senator in Louisiana, and I have a question about currency manipulation. My boss has continued to call on the administration to address currency manipulation and TPP. And I think he would admit that it's not an ideal platform, but it's a serious issue and has serious negative impacts on the U.S. And so I guess if we can't address currency manipulation in TPP, then what are other mechanisms to actually have enforceable disciplines? Because I think the hardest thing about currency in a free trade agreement is how do we implement it and how do we enforce it. But what are our realistic choices outside of NFT right now to enforce currency disciplines?
Well, I think this is an area where Treasury and the IMF should have been able to do more than they have. And one issue is even defining manipulation becomes difficult. So the IMF uses 3 methodologies, but the 3 methodologies are also different, that no country ends up falling into being a manipulator on all 3. There are a lot of signs out there about manipulation. I mean, the most obvious is just intervention in the currency markets. And my colleagues, Joe Gagnon and Fred Bergston, have, of course, done a lot of work on this. And I think, what they suggest is a countervailing intervention. So when one country intervenes to a certain extent, you can countervail to the same extent, and basically, so that while the U.S. has agreed not to intervene, they will intervene to counter what other countries' actions. The question is whether that's feasible with countries that don't have open financial markets, where most manipulators are also financially repressed systems, and then it becomes more difficult because you can't always really have access to offset. They believe now it's possible. I mean, I'm speaking mainly with respect to China. And again, I think this is hugely important. There is now a huge body of research showing how important the extent of sort of, undervaluation is to supporting your export sector at the expense of other countries, and this kind of negative spillovers that it has on the rest of the world. So that's where, as I said, I do see a role in a trade agreement. On the other hand, it really would have to be thought through, and my understanding now is that there's some vague words on what currency would look like in a trade agreement. But then it's harder, although I think it's an important step, because if currency, even with vague words, is in TPP, then China eventually wants to join. However vague it is at that point, it's at least already there. You know, the foot is in the door. So I think at least having those vague words in there is probably gonna serve an important purpose.
Great. Well, on behalf of Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy, please join me in thanking the panelists for what a great discussion.